The image of the medieval knight pervades Western culture to an extent that many of us don't even realize. You've probably heard a man being described as a knight in shining armor, figuratively, of course, but someone who suddenly swoops in and has this rescuing effect. And you've seen countless films, whether they're about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, or Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail. We are surrounded by these images of men in full body armor, mounted on horses, riding off to do brave deeds and rescue damsels in distress. To what extent are these images a fantasy take on a time in history that is long since past? And how much of what we see here is a reflection of a reality that actually existed? Some people think of knights as something that's very British or French, but in fact, the knight, or the mounted warrior in armor, was seen across Europe. It was all over. It wasn't limited to just England or France. One of the most famous Spanish stories around knighthood is written by a man called Miguel de Cervantes in 1605, and it's called Don Quixote. This is a story about a slightly mad Spanish knight, extremely idealistic and very unrealistic, who's known for tilting at windmills, which is actually a phrase we still use in English from time to time. And there's another word that has been invented as a direct result of this literary character. To call someone quixotic is a word that's derived from Don Quixote, and it's a reflection of a very romantic, unrealistic view of the world, which was the definition of this particular character. So, in Cervantes' story, Don Quixote is this middle-aged Spanish nobleman who's read a few too many knightly, chivalric romance books. And he begins to see the world through the lens of a knightly adventure, starring, of course, himself as the main character. And he recruits a peasant by the name of Sancho Panza to be his noble squire, and mounted on his horse Rocinante, they traverse the Spanish countryside looking for noble causes to fight in and damsels in need of rescue. And the story gets quite ludicrous because Don Quixote mistakes barmaids for princesses in captivity, and windmills for giants in need of slaying. Many hilarious adventures ensue as the misguided knight pursues his quest. One of Don Quixote's statements is, quote, "A knight without a mistress is like a tree without fruit or leaves, or a body without a soul." And this line underscores the idea, common to all chivalric romances, that a knight is not a knight until he has a lady in whose name he does his deeds of bravery. But the character of Don Quixote wasn't just invented in the wild imagination of Cervantes. He was referring to actual Spanish knights who had existed at one point, although he was doing a very comedic take on the whole idea. Today, I'm going to introduce you to a Spanish knight whose name you probably haven't heard. And he is Suero de Quinones. He swore to break 300 lances in combat for love of a lady, and his story is just as wild as the craziest Arthurian legend you've ever read. But he wasn't a literary character, he was a real historical figure. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and in this episode we're talking about knighthood, chivalry, courtly love, and a very particularly romantic Spanish knight. But before I get into the story, I want to stop and make a note about the people who make this podcast possible by supporting it on Patreon. In particular, those who are supporting at the highest level on Patreon include Richard Hubner, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, Gordon Carl, and Agnes Weiner. I want to say a special note of thanks to these people and all the others who support the podcast on Patreon. Now, if you're interested in even more historical content, behind-the-scenes takes, and live conversations after the release of each new podcast episode, you might want to consider joining the Villains and Virgins community on Patreon. You can find me on patreon.com/Eva Schubert. I want to tell you the story of Suero de Quinones. whose story I stumbled upon when I crossed a medieval bridge into the town of Hospital de Orbigo in Spain while doing the Camino de Santiago. But I also want to tell you about the world he lived in and the ideals that shaped this man and the class that he was a part of. This was the period that historians sometimes refer to as late medieval. So we're talking about the 1400s or the 15th century. Now, it's impossible to talk about knights without talking about chivalry. And the word chivalry is derived from the French word chevalier, which refers to a mounted warrior, a man with armor on a horse. And of course, there were many other terms for this outside the French language. Knight, or Knecht, comes from German and Old English, and we have the Spanish caballero, which is a word for the same thing. The word chivalry, then, is a term that refers to a code of values and behaviors that men who were part of this class of mounted warriors were expected to follow. In fact, these ideas of chivalry had been developing across Europe since the 10th century, and their objective was to transform mounted fighters into knights, whose behavior supposedly marked them out as different from commoners and criminals. So, who was Suero? He was the second son of a wealthy landowner and nobleman in the Spanish city of Leon, in the Kingdom of Castile. Suero was one of 10 children, which wasn't unusual at that time, and he lived one generation before Isabella of Castile, who you might know because she's extremely famous historically as part of the Isabella and Ferdinand couple, who are perhaps the most famous Spanish monarchs of all time, the same people who sponsored Christopher Columbus in 1492. So Suero and this story take place one generation before. We think he was born about 1409, although we don't have exact dates for this. Like many boys growing up in a noble household, Suero was educated by a private tutor whose job it was to ensure that he grew up with an adequate understanding of literature, poetry, music, and the sort of attitudes that were appropriate to someone from the noble class. Like many other noble boys, he was also destined to be a knight. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of turning young boys into knights, because it was actually quite lengthy. In many cases, training began as young as 7, or at least between the ages of 7 and 10, when a young boy would commence his training as a page or a page boy. He might be sent to a larger noble household, where there were a large number of knights and squires and ladies, and in this place he would begin to undergo his training. One of the first tasks that these boys had to learn was how to ride a horse skillfully without using their hands. So how to be able to direct that horse with their knees and feet, because their hands were going to be very full. They were going to be carrying shields and lances or swords, usually made of wood at this stage, because this was the practice or training ground for children, but it was very important to master riding without using your hands. Page boys also worked as stable hands, so many of their duties included brushing down the horses, mucking out the stables, and generally understanding what was required to care for these animals. In addition to this, they also helped serving at the table during mealtimes, and so they were passing dishes, they were ensuring that the diners had what they needed, but they were also enjoying a front row seat to learning the customs and the manners that were appropriate to people in noble households. Nevertheless, page boys were still very young. I mean, boys between the ages of 7 and 10 are still very much children, and so to a certain degree, they were looked after by the ladies of the noble household, the ladies of the castle. When page boys turned 14, or round about the time that they were in the middle of puberty, they could graduate to being squires. So a squire was a role with more responsibilities. It is actually a term that comes from the term shield bearer, and that's because this was one of the squire's primary responsibilities, was to follow his knight around, to carry his gear, to ensure that his armor was properly polished, that his weapons were maintained, and to assist him wherever he went. So this includes jousting matches and even the battlefield. In addition to polishing weapons and armor, a squire had to further refine his own fighting skills. And he did this through precision drills, jousting with a lance on horseback in the tilt yard or the training ground, as well as through hand-to-hand combat with blunted or wooden weapons where he was refining his skills fighting on his feet. In addition to these things, he also participated in hunting for wild game, hunting being a major sport and preoccupation for the noble classes, and the squire's participation in this also contributed to putting food on the table for the noble household. Hunting also frequently involved learning how to hunt with falcons or dogs, which is another set of skills altogether. And quite apart from the martial skills that squires were expected to learn, they also had to master things like Latin, literature, poetry, dancing, and music. Because the role of a knight as a mounted noble wasn't just to be a good fighter. There was also a basic level of education and refinement, the ability to have educated and courteous conversations that was expected of boys in this class. It was probably close to age 21 that Suero de Quinones became a knight. Now, there was nothing automatic about this. Knightly training had these 3 stages, page boy, squire, and knight, and you had to pass through each of the preceding ones satisfactorily before you could hope to go to the next level. And there were many people who spent 7 years, from age 14 to 21, training as squires, but never actually got to become knights. There were a number of reasons for this. It's possible that the squire never developed enough dexterity on a horse or in combat to qualify him. It's possible that he wasn't a very good student in some of the other required areas he was supposed to master. And one of the major reasons was that perhaps the squire didn't have the requisite amount of wealth. One of the reasons why, by the time we get to the 1400s, almost all knights come from noble families, is that you needed a large amount of money to purchase armor, weapons, and most importantly, a warhorse. And not everyone had this kind of capital. So there were men who spent their teens working as squires and either were released to pursue other careers. Geoffrey Chaucer was one such, the author of the Canterbury Tales. He spent his teens as a squire in a noble household, but he didn't move on to being a knight. In other cases, the squire, who was now a young man, if he didn't become a knight, might nevertheless have stayed a fighter. He just wasn't officially knighted because he didn't have the money to invest in the warhorse and the accoutrement that would be required. And so these men fought alongside knights. They were, in many cases, equally skillful, but they didn't have the actual title. But Suero did become a knight. And so probably at about age 21, there was a formal ceremony. Now, I'm going to give you the outlines of what that might have looked like. This is a general sort of outline. The actual details could vary depending on which country you were in and whether you were joining a particular knightly brotherhood or order, which might have their own extra details that would be added on to this. But in general, the ceremony for becoming a knight looked something like this. The young man would make confession to a priest the evening before the ceremony was due to take place. And this confessing of your sins and purification of the spirit was a very important preamble to this ceremony. He would also bathe, he would give himself a shave or a beard trim or whatever was necessary so that he was neat and tidy. He would put on fresh clothing and lie down in a clean bed. Now, you know you're in the Middle Ages when these things are specified because you couldn't take them for granted necessarily that people would automatically put on clean clothes or be sleeping in a clean bed. But this was part of the requirements for this particular episode. Now, the young man might not go straight to bed. In many cases, he would be expected to spend some hours or even all night in a chapel, and this was called keeping vigil, where he might spend many hours, or indeed all night long, praying and contemplating the profound transition that he was about to undergo. The next morning, he would be ritually dressed in a white tunic to symbolize the purity of his body and spirit, often dark-colored stockings to represent the earth in which he would be buried, and a red cloak to symbolize the blood that he was now willing to shed. Whether that was his own or belonged to other people is left ambiguous. You can be sure there would be both in a long career as a knight. He would also be given spurs. And this is where we have the English phrase, earning your spurs. It actually comes from this ceremony where being given these particular pieces of metal to affix to the heels of your boots to prod a horse was part of the ceremony, and it signified your status as a knight. So he would be given spurs, and then he'd be given back his sword, which in the interim had been blessed by a priest. So he has given back his weapon, but now it has this blessing, and he's going to achieve this new status. At this point, the young man was invited to kneel before his liege lord or the senior knight of the order. And this was the moment which is so often memorialized in film, where he's dubbed. And so this action of dubbing could take place with the flat end of a sword or even with a hand. It was usually a couple of light blows around the shoulders or neck, and he was admonished to be a knight. And this included the expectation that he would uphold the values of honor, chivalry, and nobility that were expected of him as a member of this brotherhood. Importantly, the senior knight performing this ritual had to believe that the young man in front of him was knightly material, because there was a sense in which his own reputation as a senior knight could be tarnished if he knighted somebody who turned out not to be a good representative of these knightly virtues. And there were penalties for that, ranging all the way from reprimand to having your knightly status, your spurs, and your coat of arms stripped from you, and even execution. It wasn't just, that if you didn't follow all the rules, people didn't like you very much. There could be very severe penalties for this. And the knight who had made you a knight also suffered damage to his reputation for failing to spot the fact that this particular young man wasn't the right stuff. So it was taken very seriously. There might also be additional oaths of loyalty, feudal oaths that the knight would take if the man knighting him was his liege lord, the king or the noble that he was sworn to serve. So this could be an important part of the ceremony as well. The new knight was then allowed to rise, and he was presented with his war horse, usually purchased by his family or by his noble lord on his behalf. And he was also given his family coat of arms or crest, usually emblazoned on a banner and on his shield. And at this point, he was invited to join the other knights for a feast. Now, feasts were expensive, and so very frequently these kinds of knighting ceremonies were arranged around a feast that was already going to happen, such as at Christmas or for a wedding or some such. So it wasn't that they put a feast on necessarily every time there was a new knight to be made, but it was traditional that this kind of a ceremony would be followed by a dinner. Now, this is the usual ritual outline that I've given you, but it wasn't necessarily the only way that a young man could become a knight. There are many examples we have from historical sources where a young man could be made a knight on the battlefield. And this might happen just before a battle, or it might happen in the wake of acts of exemplary bravery that he had committed, which were recognized by the other knights around him and made him a worthy member of the knightly order. And so sometimes there were battlefield knightings that took place, which would be a much more simplified scenario. Basically, the young man would kneel, he would take an oath, he would be dubbed and told to rise. And ceremonies and celebrations might be held at some point after when it was convenient. Becoming a knight wasn't just about getting a new title and status. It was a lifelong commitment to live by a very specific code of behavior. Reputation and honor were enormously important in this system, and our hero, Suero de Quinones, was demonstrably obsessed with these things. So how does a knight go about gaining honor? Well, there were a number of well-recognized ways, and the most obvious one was deeds of bravery on the battlefield. In Suero's time, the Christian nobles of Spain were engaged in an ongoing attempt to push Muslim-ruled areas of Spain farther and farther south. And this was a process that had taken several centuries already. In fact, in the early 700s, Muslims from North Africa had surged upwards through Spain and taken over some 2/3 of the territory. And so from the early 700s onward to Suero's own time in the 1400s, there'd been this gradual, ongoing attempt to push the amount of territory that Muslims ruled into a smaller and smaller space farther south. So Suero himself was engaged in battles of this kind as a young man, fighting this reconquista, or reconquest of Spain, against the Moors, which is what the Spanish called the Muslims, was very much a priority for all Spanish knights. It was one of their reasons for being. It was key to the specific flavor of Spanish knighthood as distinct from other types in Europe. Suero participated in a battle that Castilian forces fought against the Moors in Granada in 1431. This, by the way, is the very same year that Joan of Arc was burned to death as a witch and a heretic by the English. So in terms of understanding where we are in the large block that is the Middle Ages, while we have Spanish knights fighting Muslims in Spain in 1431, we had Joan of Arc very recently leading French armies against the English and then meeting her unfortunate end. Young Suero and his older brother were extremely active members in the court of Constable Alvaro de Luna. And constable to us sounds like a fairly pedestrian office, like a police constable, not very high up. But in the politics of Castile at this time, the constable was second only to the king in his power. So he was an extremely wealthy and important person to have as your patron or noble lord. And Suero was closely connected to this man as a young knight. A second way for a knight to gain honor was called deeds of arms at tournaments. Now, tournaments were formal combative events. And again, you've seen versions of this on film because the most famous and spectacular activity that they engaged in was jousting, where knights in full armor, on horseback, rode at each other at high speeds, aiming lances at each other with the attempt to knock their opponent off his horse and break his lance. So jousting was definitely a highlight event at these tournaments, but it wasn't the only event. There were also other types of combat. Earlier forms of these tournaments involved melee, which were basically simulated battles where you had teams of knights on both sides in an open field riding against each other and trying to knock each other off their horses. But this sort of simulated battle decreased in popularity because it was harder to make out in the din and the dust which knight was doing what. So gradually we see less of that and more jousting because spectators could focus on just two combatants at a time. In addition to these jousting activities, there was also hand-to-hand combat, which looked a lot more like a duel, except it wasn't to the death. Two competitors would be standing on the ground, no horses involved, and going at each other while wearing armor and wielding different types of weapons. So that activity was also very common at these tournaments. Now, these events were watched by many spectators, men and women alike, and perhaps most important were the peers and superiors, or kings and noble lords, over the knights involved. And these were an opportunity to demonstrate not just military skills, but also to model the types of behavior that were expected of knights. And what I mean by that is chivalrous behavior. So this meant generosity, including to your opponent. It meant courtesy. It meant restraint. It meant fair play. And it was as important to be seen behaving well as it was simply to be breaking lances and winning matches. Now, those of us who have read or watched stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table know that no story about a knight is complete without a lady. And this isn't just coincidence or good storytelling. Women, as objects of inspiration and motivation, were extremely important in stories about chivalry and in knightly codes. This wasn't just stories about King Arthur that knights were reading. These were the stories of their lives that knights were writing as well. And we have books written by knights that emphasize what are important behaviors and things for a young knight to do, and devotion to a woman figures again and again. And I'll give you a quote that illustrates this. "One should indeed honor, serve, and truly love these noble ladies, and others whom I hold to be noble ladies, who inspire men to great achievement. And it is thanks to such ladies that men become good knights and men-at-arms. Hence, all good men-at-arms are rightly bound to protect and defend the honor of all ladies against those who would threaten it by word or deed." Unquote. The idea was that men were spurred on to more valiant deeds when they were inspired by women. Some deeds were undertaken to impress the desired woman, while other actions were required to defend a woman or her honor against those who would insult or dishonor her. So this is part of the code of chivalry, which developed over a number of centuries and was intended to transform men from mounted thugs into warriors who would behave gently towards women, towards the weak, towards the old, towards children, towards people who were weaker than they were and who were non-combatants. In particular, knights were expected not just to behave graciously toward women, but to protect them from predatory men. So does this mean that knights didn't engage in rape? Actually, no, that's not what it means. There are many specific recorded historical events where we can see that knights did engage in rape, particularly in the Crusades. The chivalric code created a set of values that were in opposition to such behavior. But in practice, these codes were much more likely to be observed in relationship to noble women than they were towards common women, peasant women, or women from other countries or religions. Raping shepherdesses and peasant girls wasn't actually seen as a problem. And I have a quote for this as well. A source named André Le Chapelain, a 12th century Frenchman, a nobleman, who was regarded as an authority on chivalry and courtly love, told his noble audience that they could forget all about chivalry when it came to peasant women and take them by force if they felt so inclined. So again, this is not just an average guy talking about this. This is one of the nobles who's writing books that are regarded as guidebooks for other nobles as they try to absorb and embody these set of chivalric values. So it's important to note that they don't extend to peasant women. They don't extend to people outside your class. And this is one of these discoveries that runs very much against our sort of fantasized versions of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, where we imagine that these knights in their shining armor on their white horses would be defenders and protectors of all women. Well, if you were not a noblewoman, you might actually have a good reason to run and hide at the sound of those hoofbeats, rather than feel a sense of hope and rescue when you heard them approaching. Noble women were supposed to be protected from assault by lower-class men, and usually from assault by nobles, although it didn't always work that way. But peasant women were subject to assault from all directions. And this is interesting because rape was actually a crime in legal codes across Europe at this time. A knight in England, for example, could be hung if he was convicted of rape. But there's the rub. Getting a conviction and getting that punishment enforced was the glaring gap between the letter of the law and the experience that most people had living in this period. There's an amazing story that illustrates this from a place in England called Shropshire in the West Midlands, very close to Wales. And the story comes from 1405, so it's just a couple of decades before our story in Spain here, but very much of the same period. And there's a woman named Isabella Gronawasone and her two daughters. What they do is they ambush a man in a field, and his name is Roger de Polsden. So they surprise him, they tie a cord around his neck, they cut off his testicles, and they take his horse. These are all bad things, right? But the court pardoned all three women. And that's not because there was any doubt about what they had done. It's because of why they had done it. These women were exacting retribution for a rape that had been committed by Roger de Polsden. And so the court seemed to recognize the fact that, while rape was officially a crime, many women who were not nobles had enormous difficulties being believed when they brought forward charges of rape, and even more so, getting the court to actually enforce the law against the offending man, particularly if he was wealthier, or God help you, if he was of a higher social status. Your chances of getting any kind of legal satisfaction were basically nil. And so these women had taken the law into their own hands, quite literally, and had exacted justice, which was recognized by the court, even though it hadn't been administered through legal means. And what this story shows is that while justice was often hard to obtain, rape was nevertheless viewed as a crime that was deserving of punishment. But back to our young knight in Castile, Suero de Quinones. So, like many another knight, he soon found a lady to fix his attentions upon and to inspire various brave and valiant actions. And there were certain gestures that were appropriate in this situation. Suero could have been instructed by older knights and by written books on what was appropriate for knights in this situation. So there were gestures that were expected when a knight wished to demonstrate his devotion to a particular lady. And one of those things was to wear a token from that lady. It could be a ribbon or a glove or some other object that represented her, and to wear that visibly when he rode into competition in tournaments, in jousts. Another standard gesture that a knight would undertake would be to paint some motto or some symbol that represented his lady on his shield. Importantly, a knight would not reveal the name of his lady. Her identity must be kept a secret. And there were good reasons for this. In most cases, she would be married. So keeping her identity a secret was a way of protecting her honor and her reputation, as well as perhaps the knight himself from armed retribution from an angry husband. Marriage amongst noble families was normally a matter of politics, so desire didn't play much of a role in it whatsoever. But there was nothing political about the lady that a knight would choose to adore. And so these two things, love and marriage, often ran in very different directions. This entire dilemma is at the heart of the tradition of courtly love, which is an integral part of the world of medieval knights and chivalry and the preoccupations of noble classes at this time. The idea of courtly love developed in Western Europe really in the 11th and 12th centuries, and it had enormous effect on poetry, songs, and stories that we associate with this period and with the behavior of knights and ladies. The German romance of Tristan and Isolde is a classic example of this. And in this story, we have a young knight who falls in love with this beautiful woman, Isolde, and unfortunately, she's already been signed up to marry another man, a king. In fact, the same king that Tristan himself serves. And so this entire story is this agonizing tension between the two lovers who want to be together and the fact that Tristan's oaths of loyalty to his feudal overlord and king and Isolde's marriage vows pull them in exactly the opposite direction. Do they consummate their relationship? Yes, they do. But it's a real problem because that's a tension between church teachings on marriage, while at the same time glorifying the love between these two people and claiming that Tristan is nevertheless an honorable knight and sort of an exemplar of many of the virtues and military prowess and bravery and loyalty that many other knights would want to imitate. So it's a very subversive story, actually, and it reflects exactly this kind of dilemma. And of course, far more widely known is the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which comes down in the Arthurian legends. There's a very famous French version of this. Same problem. Lancelot is an important knight in the court of King Arthur. He falls in love with Guinevere, One little problem, Guinevere is the wife of King Arthur, and so again there's this knight who has this tension of loyalty to his sovereign and the love that he has for this woman who happens to be married to somebody else. This longing for and the idealization of the beloved that is so much a part of the poetry and the stories that are about this dilemma is even reflected in the 14th century sonnets of Petrarch to his beloved Laura. And these ideas were also present in the Castilian or Spanish literature that Suero de Quinones and knights of his generation were avidly reading. These courtly love stories, these ideals of longing, were part of Suero's world. And it's necessary to explain all that in order for us to understand why he goes around wearing an iron collar around his neck. So, it was in his early 20s, most likely, that Suero laid eyes on a beautiful young woman whose name was Leonor de Tovar, and she was the daughter of the chief of the king's guard, so definitely a member of the noble classes. Now, if she was an attractive young woman, it's very likely that there was more than one aspiring young knight trying to catch her eye. While we don't have documentary records of this, it would be extremely likely that young Suero was constantly on the lookout for ways to get her attention, to be of service to her in some way. Was there a glove or some object that she had dropped or left behind? Would he be writing poems and sending them to her? Almost certainly. He would be looking for ways to draw her attention and to indicate his interest. However, public statements were always more impressive than private gestures, and so Suero took to wearing this iron collar around his neck in public and explaining to people that this was a symbol of the fact that he was in chains or imprisoned by his love for this nameless lady. The idea was that word of this would get out, and that Leonor de Tovar would be curious about the young man with the iron collar. One of the major differences between courtly love and medieval marriage was that in marriage at this time, women had basically no choice in the matter. Women at very young ages were routinely negotiated into marriage by their male relatives, usually their fathers, their uncles, their older brothers. They were presented as the bride of some other powerful male ally, and there was really nothing they could do about it. However, the courtly love tradition and all these knightly stories glorified the belle dame sans merci, the beautiful woman who is adored by a knight, but is free to reject any would-be lover. Because unlike in marriage, when it came to courtly love, the woman could choose as she wished. She wasn't obligated towards anyone, and so in these cases, she would choose with her heart. And that could mean rejection. In many of these stories, the beautiful woman often rejects a would-be lover repeatedly, either until he proves himself worthy, or until he suffers some unfortunate end, still languishing due to his unfulfilled devotion. Now, one French noblewoman, who's quoted in the 14th century Book of the Knight of the Tower, yes, it was called B-O-K-E at this time in this variation of English, but the Book of the Knight of the Tower, written in the 14th century, she's quoted as advising her daughters that courtly love and these traditions are really just a ploy that men are using to get them into bed and spoil their marriage prospects. And so the wise young woman should reject would-be knightly lovers, and she gives some specific advice. She says, "Really? He swears he loves you? How long has he loved you? Only 2 years? Why, that's a mere episode of lust, which can be cured by holy water. A real courtly lover would have served you in secret for at least 7 years before daring to speak to you of the matter." So Leonor de Tovar was within a well-established tradition when she paid no attention to the meaningful glances of this young knight of Leon as he haunted the court in his iron collar. The advice of this French noblewoman about rejecting these young men wasn't as stuck up as it sounds. Virginity for a young noblewoman was extremely important as something that she would bring into her marriage. And so this particular noblewoman recognizes the dangers for a young woman who's going to be subject to these romantic advances from young knights, and who, if she gives in to one of them before she's safely married, could end up eliminating her marriage prospects altogether. So it's a very high stakes sort of situation for a young noblewoman. And the suggestion would be that if she's going to have a lover, it's far safer to do so after she's married than before. So Leonardo Tovar was within a well-established tradition when she took no notice of the dramatic color and meaningful glances that were sent her way by this young Leonese knight who was haunting the court. He almost certainly sent her poems. This would have been expected of a knight at this period. Poetry was something that teens studied as squires. It was part of their education. So to write poems of adoration for the lady of your heart would be a standard conventional move. And there are poems that are attributed to Suero's authorship. So almost certainly he was sending her these things. Perhaps also he wore some ribbons or other fabric that belonged to her, perhaps bribed off one of her serving ladies and skillfully acquired as a way to appear in her presence, displaying this as a way to signal to her that the secret lady for whose sake he wore this iron collar was in fact her. But whatever tactics from the manuals of courtly love that young Suero de Quinones was using, his lady appeared to be unimpressed. So our bold young hero came up with a very brave new plan. He approached his boss, the powerful Constable Alvaro de Luna, with a proposal to host a Paso Honroso, a pas d'armes, or a pas for short. We're just going to call it a tournament because that's how you and I recognize what he was talking about. This was something that was going to take a lot of money. And so his boss's permission and support, not just in principle, but in financial terms, was going to be necessary for the success of this venture. So when he obtained permission from the constable, he then had to write up a list of rules for how this particular tournament was going to be organized. This document still survives in translation, and it runs to some 22 chapters, detailing right down to the most minute rule what types of weapons are going to be used, how each particular match is going to be run, how people will be invited, the ways that marks will be awarded, and so on. And this was standard. Then Suero, still wearing his iron collar, and 9 other knights gained an audience with King Juan II of Castile, where they formally proposed hosting this tournament to now get the king's permission. And the reason for it that Suero gave in this interview was that he was in the prison of love, as indicated by his iron collar, and proposed to ransom himself from this suffering by breaking 300 lances in the proposed tournament. A lance was, of course, the weapon that a mounted knight would be using as he rode into a joust, a long, pointed stick, sometimes with a sharpened end, that would be rammed into your opponent at high speed in an attempt to knock him off his horse. So these things often got broken because of the force involved. And this is what Suero was referring to, that he had dedicated himself to breaking 300 of these so that he could be free from his predicament. This is a proposal that's going to involve a lot of physical suffering, just to be clear, but we'll get to that in a moment. King Juan agreed to this tournament proposal, and he even sent his own messengers up and down throughout Spain, inviting other nobles and informing them of when this tournament was going to take place. These messengers were also involved in publicizing the rules of engagement, which would standardly be delivered to knights along with the invitation. So you would understand that this event was happening, but you could also peruse the particular rules under which it would be run. The tournament would be held in the town of Hospital de Orbigo, which happens to be right on the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage route. So it's a city that is passed through by thousands of pilgrims every year at this time on their way to Santiago de Compostela to visit the bones of St. James. So that meant there was going to be a lot of foot traffic through the city just because pilgrims were passing through from all across Europe. But in addition to that, nobles, their ladies, their retinue of squires and page boys and musicians would also be flooding into the town for this event. It was scheduled for July the 1st 1434, which was peak pilgrimage season, not only because the weather was warm, but it was also very close to the Feast of St. James. So the highest number of pilgrims per year would be running through the town at this time. A mannequin was even made and set up at a road sign to direct pilgrims and other wayfarers through the town, letting them know that the tournament was going to be taking place right next to the bridge that you had to cross on your way into town. So it was a very well publicized event. Suero de Quinones and 9 of his friends set themselves up near the bridge, and they posed as defenders of the bridge or defenders of this pass. And this wasn't something they made up. This was part of an established convention around the setting up of these type of jousts or tournaments. So these knights were posing as defenders of this area, and anyone who wanted to pass over that bridge would have to deal with the knights. Now, if you were a pilgrim, you were allowed to pass freely. You didn't have to engage in any sort of combat. But they were there, and they made their presence known as an invitation to knights, some of whom might be passing through on their way to make the pilgrimage, and others who had traveled to this town for this specific purpose. Suero did stipulate that any noble lady attempting to cross over the bridge would be required to leave a glove as a token with the defending knights, and then any other knight who wanted to reclaim that glove to give it back to the lady who was required to leave it would have to fight them for it, saving only the nameless lady to whom Suero himself was devoted. So he couldn't speak her name, but she would not have to leave any gloves because the only person who was going to defend her gloves and keep them on her hands would be he himself. This was mostly said for effect, and if she happened to pass by, she would just not be required to leave a glove, and that would be one indication that she was the particular lady of his regard. Of course, no gloves were required for visiting knights to show up and just challenge Suero and his friends to combat. So the glove is just an extra detail that can be used as an excuse, but it wasn't required to engage in the competition. So you have to imagine a hot July afternoon and hundreds, if not thousands of people milling around this stone bridge which arches up and into town. Hundreds of pilgrims and unknown other numbers of visiting knights, ladies, servants, musicians, dancers, and all the other people who are going to be involved in this event. The jousts in this tournament occurred every day for a period of weeks. And in the evening, they were followed by dancing, feasting, and music. So this is really the equivalent of a festival. The whole thing went on for nearly a month. And that requires an enormous amount of money to support all these people, to feed them, to pay for the entertainment, and so on. There were important traditions around these combat events, such as when one knight was defeated by another, whether this was in a joust or in a hand-to-hand combat, the knights were required to touch hands or make some other gesture of friendship, and often to leave the field arm in arm. It was customary for the challenger to give a dinner that evening in honor of his opponent, the defending knight, in this case, Suero or one of his friends. And these jousting events combined elements of both sport and theater. Yes, there was real physical competition and injury, but there was also an element of the theatrical and the imaginary. Knights would sometimes take stage names like the Dark Knight or the Unknown Knight. They would appear under these assumed identities. There could even be fake trees that were set up to display the shields of the competitors with their coats of arms or family crests and insignia painted upon them. So there was a lot of visual display and music and even role-playing around the actual combat sports themselves. The rules of engagement in these tournaments were extremely important, and their purpose was to protect the honor of all of the men engaging in the competitions. The rules of engagement around these jousts were extremely important, and they were designed to protect the honor of every man who participated, and hopefully to prevent resentment and anger that could boil over into a blood feud after the competition was over. Typical issues addressed by the rules were the requirement for every competitor to demonstrate noble lineage on both sides of the family. Why is that important? Well, if you were from a noble family and you were knocked off your horse or otherwise defeated by a knight who didn't have noble lineage, that would be a kind of a dishonor. Rules also covered details like what type of weapons would be used, whether they would be sharp or blunted, and so on. Typically, the weapons would be supplied by the entrepreneur, as they called them, or the instigator, the one who organized the joust. And so the entrepreneur would supply the range of weapons that had been promised in the rules, and then the competitors or the challengers would have first choice from that selection of weapons before any particular match. And the idea here was to prevent people from coming in with their own illegally modified gear, maybe a sharp weapon when the rules were that they should be blunted, or a weapon that had a different balancing or weight than what was required by the rules. There were also rules on the types of harness or saddles that knights were supposed to wear in these competitions, because obviously some of those could make it much harder to unhorse a particular knight in a joust. If you were tied into your saddle, or you had a saddle that was constructed higher in the front and back than it would be normal, you could be much, much harder to knock off your horse, which would give you an unfair advantage. So the rules tried to cover contingencies like this. And there were, of course, judges appointed to these events to make sure that the rules were followed and violators were sanctioned. And usually judges were chosen from the ranks of older knights, especially higher-ranking nobles, as well as heralds who were extremely familiar with the rules and codes around these types of events. So judges would be seated close enough that they could watch the action, but the events were also controlled by marshals. And these guys were actually out in the field, ensuring that spectators were kept out of harm's way, but also standing by to separate competitors themselves if it became necessary. So judges and marshals would be working together to ensure that these tournaments ran according to the rules. You can see very similar echoes of this in boxing tournaments today, where there are judges and referees. It's the same structure, and it's there for the same purpose. Of course, there were always people who attempted to break these rules, sometimes to gain an unfair advantage, and other times to demonstrate bravado. So these are two very opposite kinds of motives. One of them would be disapproved of by the knightly code, and the other is very much in keeping with it. So in this particular competition, one challenger was found to be tied into his saddle, which was giving him a cheating kind of advantage, and another was found to be riding in a saddle that was built deliberately higher in the front and the back than was allowed, which again was giving him an unfair advantage. Now, curiously enough, in the case of the cheater with the high saddle, when the judges pointed this out, the defending knight, one of Suero's friends, pleaded with the judges to allow the cheater to keep his high saddle. He said that he was willing to ride against him even if he used 100 saddles. So the idea was basically, look, I know he's breaking the rules, but I don't care because I'm going to beat him anyway. So actually allowing him to keep his unfair advantage would make a victory by the defending knight look even more glorious. And glory, above all, was what these guys were after. Similarly, Suero himself broke one of his own tournament rules, which was that no competitor was allowed to remove pieces of their armor when they were on the field unless the judges had approved it. While on the field, ready to joust, Suero removed his left shoulder pauldron, or the plate that protected that particular part of his arm. He wanted to remove his placard, which covered his stomach, and also his visor, which was the part of his helmet that protected his eyes. It seems that Suero did this in response to a competitor who arrived wearing particularly heavy armor, and so this was a gesture of mockery, like, you come very heavily armored, and I'm so brave that I'm going to actually remove pieces of my protection before I fight you. That's how not worried I am. Now, the judges immediately objected. Think about the consequences of fighting without these particular pieces of armor. Think about jousting for a second. These are men riding on horses toward each other at high speeds, so you can double the speed and force as they come together. And they're carrying lances, these wooden sticks that they're attempting to slam into each other upon impact with the goal of knocking the opponent off the horse. The force that is multiplied in this scenario is awful to imagine. And there are contemporary reports of people who've tried to reenact these jousts who compare the impact to car crashes. It was intense. And so to ride into that without even the metal armor that you were wearing, if you think about the effects of getting a lance through your shoulder, through your stomach, or into your eye, it's horrifying. And we actually have historical evidence of knights who did suffer these types of injuries. There was a king who got a lance through his eye in a joust, and others who suffered brain damage, fractured ribs, broken bones. It was an extremely serious scenario. And so it's with that backdrop that you have to imagine Suero in his 20s with this bravado saying, yeah, you know what? I don't actually need this visor. I don't need this left shoulder protection, which is the shoulder that would be aimed for. I don't need this stomach protection. I'm so confident. The judges said, you know what? Forget about it. They stopped the music. They had Suero hauled off the field and imprisoned in his own pavilion, and they were so annoyed with this flagrant violation of the rules that they prohibited any other matches from happening that day. So even Suero, although he'd written these book of rules for this particular tournament, was not allowed to flout them himself. The judges were going to ensure that things were done with a reasonable measure of safety insofar as you could have anything like that in a joust, and what Suero was offering to do was beyond the pale. So it wasn't just winning these matches that mattered. You have to think about jousting as a performative event. And these men are performing bravery and military skill. There's aim and there's nerve required to be knocking somebody off their horse. But it was equally important to be generous, to be courteous in victory and defeat, and to demonstrate a sense of brotherhood and respect for the other knights that you faced in these competitions. It was permissible to put yourself at a disadvantage. That was consistent with the rules of chivalry and bravery, but it was dishonorable to try and give yourself an unfair advantage. So ideally, the combat should be as fairly matched as possible. Although you could choose to make your own position more difficult, you should not be attempting to gain a sneaky advantage over your opponent. And importantly, insulting the bravery or ability of your opponent was also a bad thing to do, at least verbally. This emphasis on courtesy and brotherhood is really important when you remember that all of these knights are part of the same noble class, and while they're competing with each other on this particular summer afternoon, they might need to fight alongside each other in a battle against the Moors very soon. And they're not going to be effective if they have ongoing resentments and hatred for each other based on bad behavior or embarrassment at one of these matches. And that's why there is such a strong emphasis on this kind of chivalrous behavior towards your opponent. Now, there's one report from another tournament that was held in France, which is interesting because it gives an example of a knight who demonstrated unchivalrous behavior and the result of that. His name was Martin Ballard, and when he arrived at the tournament, he immediately began running his mouth, and he said something like, "I could take on 3 or 4 of those defending knights all by myself in single combat." So he's swaggering, and he's sort of demeaning them with his comments, which apparently garnered some derisive laughter from the judges who watched this, but already he was demonstrating bad manners. Now, when the time came for this Martin Ballard to ride in the lists to joust, he rode so badly that he wasn't even within range to hit his opponent or be hit by his opponent. So that means that he was either technically incompetent or he was a coward. So this was noticed and observed by all of the spectators, all of the judges, all of the other competitors. So when the time came for Martin Ballard to compete on foot in hand-to-hand combat, his noble opponent offered to take off several pieces of armor just to offer him a fair fight. Because at this point, everyone's opinion of Martin Ballard's behavior and skills was extremely low. And so this knight is making this oh-so-gracious gesture, which is the most devious form of insult. Now, scribes who recorded these events, as they often did, because it wasn't just the knight's behavior that was witnessed at these spectacles, but it was the record of these spectacles that would preserve bravery and honor and chivalry for future generations. And so these things would typically be written down for posterity. The scribes who did that were usually very careful to avoid criticizing directly the honor or conduct of any of the knights. They would note dryly that this particular knight had broken a rule or tried to cheat, but they wouldn't typically make any further commentary on that. The case of Martin Ballard is a notable exception. The scribe recording this event even questions whether Ballard's noble lineage, which you have to demonstrate, was up to snuff. The idea being that his behavior was so unknightly that we can scarcely believe that he really is of noble lineage. The scribe must have been reflecting the consensus of nobles at the event when he remarked that Ballard's behavior was so bad that it should be written down as an example to future young knights, in order that, quote, they must avoid being too boastful or free with their tongues, for it is often the case that the one who appears to be a lion through his speech is revealed as a sheep through his actions. These are words that are as true today as they ever were, and the concept here is that it's better to be quiet and let the quality of your actions speak for who you are than attempt to advertise them to all and sundry, which is usually a sign that you don't really know what you're doing. So Suero and his band of 9 defenders were very successful with their project of breaking hundreds of lances. At one point, they had even defeated 9 knights, led by a man called Suero de Quinones, and these knights were very resentful at their defeat. The Paso Honroso, or the tournament of Suero de Quinones, finally ended on August the 9th, and there was a great procession as all of the knights and the judges and the ladies and the dancers rode through the town to signal the end of this incredible event. On this final day, Suero appeared before the crowds and the judges, and he declared that he had achieved his goal of breaking 300 lances, and he was now free of the prison of love. And in gesture of this, he removed his iron collar and presented it to the judges, while the crowds roared in approval. They'd been watching his performance over the last several weeks, and he had no doubt distinguished himself, not only with his bravery, but with his courtesy and his bravado. He then vowed to perform the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which he then did shortly after returning home to Lyon. When Suero completed his pilgrimage and entered the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela, he deposited a golden bracelet around the neck of a statue of St. James that was then inside the cathedral. And he did this to symbolize his release from the prison of love and to thank St. James for this liberation. Now, I didn't realize that I was inadvertently following the steps of Suero de Quinones because I started my Camino de Santiago pilgrimage from the city of Lyon, just as he did, and made it to the very same cathedral. I discovered his story en route, and so I was very excited to enter the cathedral and look for this bracelet that this medieval knight had deposited there as a symbol of his exploits. Unfortunately, although I looked and looked inside the cathedral, I couldn't find it. So I did a little bit of reading, and I discovered that this bracelet and the bust that it had been attached to had now been located outside the cathedral and moved into a museum right next door. They had a different statue of St. James that resides in the cathedral today. So very excitedly, I went into this museum searching only for this particular bracelet. And I went through the floors. I asked the staff, who raised an eyebrow at this strange red-headed woman who was so bent on finding this particular bracelet from the medieval period. And I was delighted to finally discover it. It was in a beautiful room with cathedral-like vaulted ceilings and an enormous wooden frame that went from the floor to the ceiling and contained all manner of carvings and symbols and images. And somewhere near the center of it was a gold-covered bust of what I now recognized as St. James. And around its neck, there was a golden bracelet with purple jewels in the center. I was almost certain that I had found it, but I had to go and actually ask one of the museum staff because there was no plaque or any sort of writing to indicate definitively that this was the bracelet I was seeking. And they confirmed that it was. So even today, you can find the bracelet left by Suero de Quinones at the end of this summer of knightly adventure. But what about the girl? Was Leonard de Tovar really still indifferent to this young knight from Lyon who had spent an entire month risking the safety of his body and engaging in these sorts of daring deeds to prove his devotion to her? And was Suero truly free from the prison of love? Well, apparently not. We don't have records of what messages may have passed between Suero and Leonard, but we do know that this tournament positioned him as a very brave, very chivalrous, and very well-connected young knight, because he was able to demonstrate that he could successfully acquire the financial support of the constable and the approval of the king to host an event with himself as very much a central figure that would have been attended by the who's who of Castile. So it was a great way to shine a spotlight on himself and to indicate that he really did exemplify all of the virtues of an eligible knight and bachelor. This surely helped persuade Leonard's father, the chief of the king's guard, that young Suero was a worthy suitor. A few months later, in 1435, Suero married the lady of his heart, and he and Leonard had 3 children over the course of their marriage. He also had a very colorful battlefield career in Castile, which was engulfed in a series of civil war conflicts over the ensuing decades. But that wasn't how he met his end. It's an almost bizarre footnote. It was almost 28 years to the day, on July 11th, 1458, that Suero de Quinones encountered in a field none other than the vengeful knight Gutierrez de Quijada, the same one who had rode off swearing vengeance after the original tournament in 1434. The 2 men did exactly what knights with a grudge would do. They lowered their visors and they rode at each other. Suero suffered a wound as part of the impact of this particular fight, and he died sometime later of complications from that injury. While he died as a middle-aged man, having lived not a very long life, we can only imagine that it was the sort of death he would approve of. On horseback, as a knight, riding in defense of his honor. To this day, every summer, in the Spanish town of Hospital de Orbigo, a tournament is held to commemorate this original jousting match hosted by Suero de Quinones and his brave friends. Men on horseback, dressed in beautiful armor and knightly regalia, still ride against each other in celebration of this tradition and in honor of this historical event. While the term chivalry has over time lost much of its meaning and been reduced to some sort of mild version of courtesy, it was originally a very powerful concept because it balanced strength with courtesy, with a respect for your opponent, and with kindness towards those who were weaker than you. It was as much about character as it was about defeating the enemy. And in this, Western chivalric codes have much in common with other warrior codes that developed in different cultures over time, and were intended to differentiate the behavior of warriors from that of criminals, murderers, and people who were just committing wanton cruelty and destruction. What makes a warrior different from those people? In theory, it's that the warrior operates according to a system of values. Force is constrained by principle and not just inflicted on anybody who happens to be in the way. Many of the rules around fight sports and competitions today, including boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, have evolved from these original principles of chivalry in jousting competitions. But even more importantly, principles that informed the Geneva Convention or humanitarian laws and principles around warfare are directly descended from the original Western chivalric code. The difference is that these principles have taken the idea of chivalry and instead of applying it only to nobles or people in the same class, have applied these principles of restraint of force and the discipline of force to all parties in a conflict. You're not supposed to be killing women and children, or soldiers who have surrendered, or people who are unarmed. You're not supposed to be holding children for ransom. All of these ideas were originally part of Western chivalric code, but have now been adapted to apply to all the parties in a conflict. At its core, chivalry constrained the use of force around principles. And while these principles were never perfectly followed, we are far, far better in a world with these as ideals than one without them. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Villains and Virgins podcast. And if you did, make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss our next round of fascinating stories from history. And if you want even more, head over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and join the Villains and Virgins podcast community, where you can access live conversations after the release of each new episode and additional content as part of that platform. I hope I'll see you in the next episode.